Cool. So I'm Monica. I'm a partnerships lead at Alloy, essentially managing our partnership strategy. We've also got Jason today, our solutions consulting manager. You are in luck. Jason and I are OG at Alloy. He's been here about 2 years. I've been here almost 2. Jason's giving our demo today, and I'll be moderating the chat box, but I figured I'd give you guys a little bit of context about Alloy before I hand it over to Jason. So we really think of Alloy as a command center for managing identity. So our goal is to make financial services safer and more seamless, and those two things tend to be at odds with each other in a lot of current solutions. So we want to offer the financial institutions a more transparent and dynamic way to manage their customer lifecycle when it comes to identity and all of their compliance and regulatory needs. We came to the market with our onboarding product, which emphasizes fraud detection, KYC, and AML, as well as like a whole host of third-party data products. But we've since released a transaction monitoring product, and we're actually going to be publicly announcing our credit underwriting product next month. For today, we're focusing on onboarding. Jason's going to crush this demo, I can already tell. But I would just think about how the platform is set up and kind of think about that like no code drop down feature as it relates to like how you might want to set up transaction monitoring rules or approval criteria for somebody's credit application. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jason.
Awesome. Thank you, Monica. My name's Jason Ioannidis. I appreciate the lack of an attempt on the last name because people typically don't get it right on the first shot. We're going to be walking through Alloy's onboarding product today. I meant to start a timer right at the top of this, but I didn't. So here we go. We'll stay under time for sure. So what we're looking at here is what Alloy refers to as an application or a workflow. And what this fundamentally represents is a visual representation of the Alloy API's business logic. A simpler way of putting that would be, this is what the actual onboarding workflow looks like for a given client. So what Alloy is going to do is we're going to connect out to a number of third-party data sources. So industry names like iovation, LexisNexis, Socure, Ekata, ID Analytics. We're going to reach out to those third-party data sources, and using the data that comes back from them, we're going to start making intermediary decisions. And an easier way to understand what we mean by intermediary decisions is probably to just refer to them more simply as rules. Once we decision all those rules, we're going to come to a final outcome, which is kind of the consolidated decision for the entire workflow. And we're going to return that to the end client typically being a financial institution, a fintech, a bank, whatever it may be. So our goal here is really to allow our clients to make a single API call to Alloy, which Alloy then separates out and sends to the appropriate third-party data sources, and then return a consolidated outcome, that traditional approve, review, or decline. Now, of course, everything in the Alloy platform, as we'll see as we work our way through it, is fully customizable. We also include dashboarding for all the results of all the data that we're going to see today. So jumping into the platform itself, we have what we refer to as a best practices for individual onboarding workflow here on the screen. So this is what we typically start with when we're working with a financial institution who wants to onboard just individuals for standard accounts. So savings accounts, DDAs, things like that. The data sources that we're using here are a small cross-section of the total data sources that Alloy is integrated with. Monica can keep me honest here, but I think to date we're integrated with a little north of 70 data sources. But what's going to happen is the client is going to send us an API request, and we're going to separate that data out, and we're going to send it off, the appropriate data only, of course, to, for example, iovation, ID Analytics ID Score, Socure, and Ekata. And with the data that comes back, we're going to start making those intermediary decisions that we referred to before. So the easiest way to really explain how that works is to click into one of these tags, or more simply put, rules. We'll jump into the fraud warning tag here, and we can see that it's being driven by an if statement. If the ID Analytics ID score is greater than or equal to 850, or the Socure Sigma fraud score is greater than or equal to 0.985, we'll apply the fraud warning tag to that evaluation. It's worth noting here that when Alloy integrates a data source, we also map all of the data coming back from that data source into our UI. So if I wanted to switch from Socure Sigma fraud score to Socure Sigma synthetic fraud score, I could just select that different attribute in the dropdown. I can set my comparison operator, set my threshold, and then I'm good to go once I actually save this workflow. We'll talk more about saving and version control in a moment. If I wanted to go so far as to add an entirely new attribute to this rule, I can still do that in our UI. So if I wanted to, for example, grab Ekata's identity check score, I could connect this tag to the Ekata node here. I'll switch this connection to an OR. I will select the identity check score from the dropdown, set my comparison operator, and finally set my threshold. So our goal here is really to make it possible, once an integration with Alloy is complete, for an organization's compliance team to work directly in our UI to affect changes on the onboarding policy. We want to get away from a world in which a compliance team or BSA team needs to incorporate or reach out to technical resources on the bank side every time they need to make a policy change. Our goal here is to make it possible for them to make those changes themselves. And we'll see in a moment that Alloy version controls everything and has some pretty tight role-based access controls incorporated into the platform as well to prevent somebody from making any, accidental or undesired changes to a workflow. One of the other really cool things that we can see in the platform here is actually represented by this node here. So we're checking fraud up front, and then we're rolling into the KYcAML component of the workflow. And all of these fraud check tags here are driving to this denied fraud tag. So if these conditions here are set, if fraud warning is set or device warning is set, et cetera, then we'll apply the denied fraud tag to a given evaluation. Now, if we apply denied fraud to an evaluation, we'll see in a moment under the outcomes that we're going to deny that one outright, right? But the really cool thing that Alloy is doing here is we're actually running the KYcAML component of this workflow conditionally. We can see here that if denied fraud is not set, then we'll run LexisNexis Instant ID. The converse of that is also true. If denied fraud is set, we won't run Lexis. So we're not going to do the KYC check. We're not going to do the AML check. This is a very specific example of the ability to run data sources conditionally in the Alloy platform. And what this really does is it allows our clients to reduce the number of times that they call out to data sources unnecessarily. That saves time, and that also saves money. Once we run all of our data sources and resolve all of our tags, we're going to return an outcome. And we can see the outcome logic here. If denied fraud is set, then we'll deny. Else, if these conditions are met, we'll approve. Everyone else falls to manual review. We can modify these outcomes just as easily as we can modify our tags. So we can change our denied outcome, for example, to include our OFAC match tag. We'll switch this to an OR, switch this to set, and hit done. And now we've made a change to our outcome logic. This configurability extends as far as adding entire new data sources. So for example, if we wanted to add an adverse media check, for example, we can jump into our services. We'll go ahead and grab LexisNexis World Compliance and hit submit. And just like that, I've added a new service to the workflow. Now, I probably only want this to run in the case that we're not denying for fraud. So I'll hook it up here. We can now see if denied fraud is not set, then run LexisNexis World Compliance. And the last step here is to add the actual check. So I'll add a dependent action here. I'll grab my adverse media confidence score. We'll say that needs to be greater than or equal to 0.99. And then we'll tag with adverse media. So just like that, I've added an entire data source and a new rule to our workflow. I can also hook that new rule into our existing logic by grabbing our denied KYC tag here and connecting it to the adverse media tag. What I really want to drive home here, though, is that everything we're doing in this platform is something that can A, be accomplished directly in our UI without any engineering lift, and B, everything that we're looking at here is fully customizable. So we could hypothetically start from scratch with a blank canvas, incorporate whatever data sources and decisioning we need, and the Alloy team would be there to help an organization through every step of the way. Our last step here to actually memorialize these changes would be to save the workflow. And when we do so, you'll note that Alloy actually creates a change log for us. So every step that I just took as we went through that workflow has been recorded here. We added world compliance, we added adverse media, we modified our thresholds in the SOAK here component, and then we can also add a human readable note here. So I'll go ahead and just say added adverse media, and I'll hit save new version at the bottom. And that verbiage is actually pretty important because we're not overwriting anything here. Alloy just iterated from version 325 to version 337. And if I jump back to the individual onboarding workflow itself, I can actually see every version of this workflow that's ever been created. And if I click into one, I can see that change log. I can see who made the changes, what tags are available, what data sources are available, and what the parent version was. And what this really drives home is the fact that, first off, when we save a workflow, it doesn't automatically become active. We'd have to check this active checkbox. And second, if we ever make a change that we don't like or need to undo, we can always revert to a previous version. I'm going to pause there and just check with my partner, Monica. Are we good on any questions that need to be asked?
I am sipping through them in the chat box.
Perfect. Awesome. So from here, we're going to jump over to the evaluations view because I want to show the team, before we hit time, what the actual output of one of these workflows looks like. It's worth noting that we're in a demo account right now. This is all sandbox data. So if I jump into, for example, Todd Spencer's evaluation here, we'll be able to see the output of the workflow itself. So at the top, I can see Todd's name. I can see the current outcome, which is manual review. That's what was output by the workflow. I can see a link to the workflow and the version. So if I clicked on that, it would bring me back to that decision tree view we were just in, time and date of the evaluation. And then over here in the top right corner, I would argue is the most important information. We have all the tags, those gray components that were triggered in the workflow. I can see here that we had pretty much a full KYC match except for the name. And then up here in outcome reasons, I have denied KYC. So this person failed KYC because their name was not verified. That's why they're in manual review. So already I'm starting to put the pieces together and understand what I'm going to need to do to remediate this review. On the left side in the match data section, I can see all of the submitted PII alongside which data sources it did or did not match. And in this case, I can see the only outlier is Lexis for the name. And if you recall from the workflow itself, we're using Lexis for this particular workflow to resolve all of our KYC matches. So all these pieces are starting to link up for me. The name was not verified, we failed KYC, Lexis was the culprit here. So as a follow-up, we're probably going to have to follow whatever bank policy dictates to remediate a name mismatch, typically getting some kind of ID. In a longer time frame, we would talk more about how Alloy can actually ingest IDs automatically with our SDK and pass them through data sources like Socure, Vouched, Onfido, and Persona to verify them automatically. Today, we'll probably just do things manually through the UI.
And Jason, could you touch on how we can segment the manual review queue so that different kind of analysts can look at different queues?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we're going to talk about that for sure. Just before we jump over there, I just want to point out in the diligence section, we'd have any watch list hits. All of our fraud scores are aggregated here. And if we click on any of these links, we can see a blurb from the provider alongside what the best practice thresholds are, just to give a little more context to anyone reviewing this case. And then in the upper right corner, we can also access the raw API response, because I think it's really important to drive home that the primary way that an organization will interact with the Alloy platform is via API. And every bit of the data that's available here in the dashboard is also going to be returned to a given financial institution via API. So our outcome is right here, outcome reasons, tags, all the way down to all of the raw data that comes back from the third-party data sources. So here we can see Akata's third-party response, not really meant for direct decisioning outside of the workflow, but more for audit purposes. So to Monica's point with these last few minutes, I just want to jump over to our review queue so we can talk about how we'd actually get Todd out of review. And apologies, I'm on Airbnb Wi-Fi right now, so things might load a little more slowly than usual. From this view, we're actually currently looking at what we call a saved search. So I'm looking at all my manual reviews in the sandbox environment. I can also sort these, for example, by tag. So if I only wanted to see my KYC reviews, I could sort my reviews for just the KYC tag, and then I can save this search. So we've actually already done that. You can see it named up here as KYC reviews. But if I save this search string, I can then assign it to users through our role-based access control system. What that would allow me to do is create separate queues for different types of cases and then assign them to specific users where they would see those specific queues as their default view. So my doc review team can only look at KYC reviews. My loss prevention team would only see the fraud cases. We can really align this exactly to the bank or the fintech's required policy. But just to very quickly resolve Todd Spencer's case, we'll click review. That'll bring us back to a very similar view to what we were looking at before. So I will be able to see all the evaluation data down here, but up here I have a 15-minute timer that tells me this is locked to my user for the next 15 minutes, and a big purple review button that actually allows me to change the status of this. As we said before, name was not verified. We failed KYC. Lexis is the culprit there. We could upload a document to the platform and then review that directly. Or we, like we mentioned before, could escalate this to automatic document ingestion and then pass that document through a third-party data source that would handle that verification for us. That would verify that the ID is real, verify that the data on the ID through OCR actually matches the data that was submitted by the client. We could even go as far as using some data sources DMV connections to verify it with an actual state authority. But for the sake of time, we're actually just going to hit the review button, which will allow us to transition this review into an approved status. We're going to select our reasons. We'll say the contact center reached out. It's worth noting that these outcomes and outcome reasons are all fully configurable. We can also add custom notes here. And we'll hit submit. And that'll transition Todd's case from a manual review into an approval. We can see that right here. Alloy will also send an outgoing webhook to whatever system it's communicating with to let them know of the change in status of this individual. And finally, we can jump over to the entity view, which actually represents the person themselves. And I just want to point out that in the onboarding decisions pane, we still have access to that original manual review evaluation. So Alloy isn't ever overwriting anything. all we're doing is creating a new event in the chain of events that allows the organization, the financial institution, to maintain tight controls over the actual audit log for this individual. And we can also jump into the manual review, see any notes that are appended there. But in general, we're trying to give every financial institution full visibility into every step that's been taken in a given onboarding. And that's Alloy right there.